All right, so chapter 13, we learned that the Poppers have trained the penguins that they're going to do this act. And they're hoping that this act becomes really popular and maybe they can make some money off it so they can pay those bills. And there are those three acts, right? The first one, they walk like soldiers. The second one, you've got Columbus and Nelson fighting each other. And the third one, you have they're climbing up ladder and they're tobogganing down. So I want you to think, would you go pay and see these penguins acting? That might be something fun. I know that's not something that I would normally get to do. Chapter 14 is called Mr. Greenbaum, and I haven't heard that name before, so that's a new character, so we'll have to see what this is about, okay? So it says, "Look here," said Mr. Popper at breakfast one morning. "It says here in the Morning Chronicle that Mr. Greenbaum, who's the owner of the Palace Theater, is in town. He's got a string of theaters all over the country, so I guess we better go downtown to see him." That evening, it was Saturday, the 29th of January, the Popper family and their 12 trained penguins, two of them carrying flags in their beaks, left the house to find the Palace Theater. The penguins were now so well trained that Mr. Popper decided that it was not necessary to keep them on leashes as they walked outside. Indeed, they walked to the bus line very nicely in the following line of march. So this is how they're walking to the bus station. So first we've got Mr. Popper, then we've got Greta and Captain Cook, then we have Columbus and Victoria, then Mrs. Popper, then Nelson and Jenny, then Magellan and Adelina, then we have Bill and Janie, Scott and Isabella, and Ferdinand and Louisa. And it looks like Ferdinand and Louisa have the flags in their mouths. The bus stopped at the corner, and before the astonished driver could protest, they all began to climb on the bus. "Do I pay half rate for birds, or do they go for free?" asked Mr. Popper. "Janie goes half rate but I'm 10, said Bill. "Hush," said Mrs. Popper, as the children found their seats. The penguins followed in an orderly fashion. "Say, mister," said the bus driver, "where do you think you're going with this exhibit?" "Downtown," said Mr. Popper. "Here, let's call it 50 cents, and let's go at that." "To tell the truth, I lost count when they started walking past me," said the driver. "It's a trained penguin act," explained Mr. Popper. "Are they really birds?" asked the driver. "Oh, yes," said Mr. Popper, "and I'm just taking them down to the Palace Theater to interview Mr. Greenbaum, the big theater owner." "Well, if I hear any complaints, off they go at the next corner," said the driver. "Fair enough," said Mr. Popper, who wanted to ask for the transfer in that case, but decided to let that go. The penguins were behaving very well. They were sitting quietly, two in a seat, while the other passengers just kept looking at them. "Sorry," said Mr. Popper, addressing everyone on the bus, "but I'm going to have to open the windows. These are Antarctic penguins, and they're used to having it a little bit colder than this." So it's the middle of winter, it's January, and he's opening all the windows on the bus. You think that the other passengers are going to be happy about that? It took Mr. Popper quite a while to open the windows, because a few of them were stuck. When he did succeed, there were plenty of remarks from the other passengers. Many of them began to complain to the driver, who told Mr. Popper to take his birds off the bus. He had to repeat this several times. Finally, he refused to take the bus any further until Mr. Popper got off. But by this time, however, the bus got so far downtown that none of them minded getting out into the street. Only a block ahead of them shone the lights for the Palace Theater. "Hello," said the theater manager, as the Poppers and the penguins trooped past him. "Sure, Mr. Greenbaum's here in my office. You know, I've heard about these birds of yours. Sorry. But I didn't really believe it. Mr. Greenbaum, meet Mr. Popper and his penguins. I'll be leaving you. I've got to go backstage." The penguins, now standing politely in 2 rows of 6, each looked curiously at Mr. Greenbaum. Ooh, 2 rows of 6. You could make an array out of that. Their 24 white circle eyes were staring at Mr. Greenbaum. "All you people crowding around the door, go back to where you belong," said Mr. Greenbaum. "This is a private conference." Then he got up and shut the door. The Poppers sat down while Mr. Greenbaum walked up and down the double row of penguins, just looking them over. "It looks like an act," he said. "Oh, it's an act, all right," said Mr. Popper. "It's the Poppers performing penguins. First time on any stage, direct from the South Pole. He and Mrs. Popper had thought up this name for the act. Couldn't we call them Popper's pink-toed penguins? Asked Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper thought for a moment. No, I'm afraid we couldn't. That sounds too much like a chorus of girls or ballet dancers, and these birds are pretty serious. I don't think they'd like to be called that. All right, said Mr. Greenbaum, show me your act. There's music to it, said Janie. Mama plays the piano. Is this true, madame? Asked Mr. Greenbaum. Yes, sir, answered Mrs. Popper. Well, there's a piano behind you, said Mr. Greenbaum. You may begin. I want to see this act. If it's any good, you people have come to the right place. I've got theaters from coast to coast. But first, let's see your penguins perform. We'd better move the furniture first, said Bill. And that is all of chapter 14. So they head downtown, they get on the bus, they get kicked off the bus because the passengers were cold, and now they are in front of Mr. Greenbaum. So who is Mr. Greenbaum, right? He owns this theater, and why do you think it's so important that they're meeting with him? Right, they're trying to make money because they want to be able to pay their bills. So Mr. Greenbaum kind of, once he sees their act, he'll decide if he likes it or not. So when we read next chapter, you're going to have to think, did Mr. Greenbaum like it? And what's going to happen if he does? The question for you to answer for chapter 14 is, why are the Poppers and the Penguins headed downtown? Why are they going downtown? Why did they get on that bus? Okay.